Welcome back. Today's lecture is Gaining Audience Attention. Have you ever had an awkward initial interaction that left you with a really bad impression? Maybe the person you met accidentally insulted your clothing, or they were just in a really foul mood, and then later when you saw them again, you just can't get that bad taste out of your mouth. You just keep thinking about that first impression. And it's like that first interaction left a stain on the whole rest of the relationship. Communication and psychology scholars call this the primacy effect. And in interpersonal communication, it's the idea that when we meet somebody, that initial interaction is often a lens through which we view the subsequent interactions. So it has a lasting impression. That's true of interpersonal communication, and it's also true of public communication. The very first things we say in a speech really matter. That first impression really affects our audience, and it can determine in a lot of ways the attitude they have about the rest of our speech. And it's also true of the conclusions of our speeches. This is called the recency effect. And interpersonal communication scholars remind us that the last interaction that we have with somebody often affects or tints how we view the whole relationship. So if it was a bad last interaction, we have a negative impression of the relationship. And this is also true of speeches. If the speech ends poorly, the audience often has a negative view of the speech. So if we're really good with the beginnings and the endings of both of our relationships and our speeches, we're giving ourselves a much better chance of having success and of achieving our goals, especially when it comes to impressing our audiences. In this lecture, I'm going to focus specifically on talking about attention getters, the primacy effect. But in our course readings, we're going to be reading about both of them. And in upcoming videos, I'll talk a little bit also about recency. But before we get into attention getters, let me just talk a little bit about introductions and conclusions as presented in the textbook and as assigned on speech number 1. The textbook readings, you'll see them in the calendar. In the textbook, the book discusses introductions and conclusions, and they introduce us to 5 main elements of introductions. All 5 of these elements will be assigned for speeches 2 and 3, but not for speech number 1. So read about those in the textbook and think about them as we move towards speeches 2 and 3. The textbook also discusses 3 elements for the conclusion. Those 3 elements won't all be assigned until speech number 2. So go ahead and read about those, and then when we get to the speech 2 assignment, you'll see all of these elements are assigned. But for speech number 1, just to review, if you watch the speech number 1 assignment directions video, I did discuss this already. But for speech number 1, for your introductions, I'm going to be asking that you have 2 elements, the attention getter and the thesis statement. I'm talking about the attention getter in this video. And for speech number 1 in your conclusion, I'm also assigning 2 elements to reinforce the purpose and to end with a powerful closing line. So that was just for your review. Let's now get into talking more about attention getters. The attention getter should be the very first thing out of your mouth that begins your speech. You want to begin after you've done all the setup for recording the videos. You want to begin right away. Very first words out of your mouth shouldn't be hi, hello, how are you? If you want to say that after the attention getter. But the very first words out of your mouth should be the attention getter. So start with a bang. Make eye contact with your audience. Practice that attention getter. And boom, start with it right away. Okay, so let's look at first strategies that are discussed in the readings that were assigned. and then I'll turn to some other strategies that weren't talked about in the textbook. So the first strategy that the textbook talks about is telling a narrative, an anecdote, telling some sort of emotionally, ideally, arousing story. This is a great strategy to begin with. The only problem is that stories are sometimes a little long or difficult to tell, so you got to make sure it's really short, punchy, and to the point. Remember, the textbook tells us about 10% of our speech should be the introduction, and the attention getter is only a part of that 10%. So you really got to make it to the point. Let's say I'm giving a speech on why I want to become a surgeon, and I decide to tell this speech with a story about how I was in a car accident, right? I was driving along and boom, this accident happened. I was severely injured. I would tell it better than this and with good details. And this leads me into saying, it was because of this horrible accident that I decided to become a surgeon and to dedicate my life to helping other people who are in medical need. Okay, so I tell a story and I tell my audience maybe why it's significant or linked to my topic. I then go into talking about becoming a surgeon. So that's an example of an emotionally arousing story. Another approach the textbook talks about is citing a surprising fact or statistic. This is a good approach. Let's say I wanted to start a speech on how difficult it is for students to graduate from college. Maybe it's a motivational speech for students. I might start with a surprising fact or statistic. Would it surprise you if I told you that around 14% of all CSN students end up with a degree or a certificate? So the challenge of graduation is significant for many people. Okay, so that was my surprising fact or statistic, okay? And that's a good setup for that kind of speech. Of course, it needs to be a true fact, a true statistic, and you should supply the source of that information in the citation of that fact or statistic. Okay, the next type of approach that is talked about in the textbook would be to ask a question. Okay, not going to lie to you, this is not my favorite approach. It's often used as kind of a throwaway. A student, is having trouble coming up with an attention getter, so they're thinking about, well, I'm giving a speech that has to do with the justice system, so let me start by saying, what is justice? Okay, not the best approach there. It's good to ask meaningful questions, interesting questions, questions that activate the audience, but make sure that it is something substantial and not just an afterthought or a throwaway. Here's an example that was from our sample student speech outline. How many of you are mothers, especially working mothers like myself, who balance jobs with raising children? Okay, that's a good question because it reveals a lot of information, tells the audience that I'm a working mother. It describes kind of what a working mother is, and it gets them to think about themselves, okay? You could do that question as either a rhetorical or a participatory question. A rhetorical question is where you don't expect the audience to actually physically respond, and a participatory question is where you do ask them to respond. Maybe you're going to ask them to raise their hands. So I just want you to think about the difference between those two. A rhetorical question needs to be stated in a certain way, and a participatory question needs to be, I think, followed up with some sort of response from you. So if you're asking for the audience to respond by participating, say raising their hands, think about how you'll respond to the various different situations. How will you respond if one person raises their hand, half the class raises their hand, the whole class raises their hand? What did that tell you? This is good because often the audience wonders, well, why did you ask me to participate, right? What did that tell you? So tell the audience what it told you. I see half of you raised your hand. Some of you might then be interested in hearing about what it's like to be a working mother since you don't have that experience. So follow up on the participatory questions. If you're doing a rhetorical question, you need to signal that, usually by just continuing the speech, not pausing or indicating with your nonverbals that you want them to answer. Who wouldn't want to be a few $1,000,000 richer? I know I would. Okay, so I didn't pause there and I followed it up. That's a rhetorical question. You could even do a series of questions if you'd like. Have you ever felt pressure to do well in school? Has school ever kept you up at night or maybe led you to think about cutting corners in your studies or even cheating? Okay, so this is a series of questions, much better than just a single kind of throwaway question. And maybe that's a speech about cheating in college, right? Or the pressure that parents put on students, something like that. Okay, so asking a question, rhetorical, participatory, or a series of questions. Those are all good approaches. Let's move on to the next one, which is to use a quotation. Again, not my favorite approach, especially if it's an afterthought or you're just being lazy. So you just go to a quote generator, you type in your subject, and you just use whatever quote pops up. Not a good approach. But let me give you an example that might be helpful in understanding what I think is a significant use of a quotation. So let's say I'm giving a speech on why I want to be a chemistry major. So I'm going to start off with a quotation. Adam Smith, in his book Wealth of Nations, writes, "Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition." And I really love this quote, and it speaks to the reason why I want to become a scientist. I'm interested in helping people overcome some of the myths and misunderstandings that affect our reality. Okay, so that's my attention getter that uses a quotation. Notice it's a great quotation. It does a lot in a little bit of space. It's better writing than I can probably write, so that makes it a pretty good quotation to use. And then I also followed up on it. I explained it. I didn't just drop some weird quote in and then move on. So using a quotation can be effective, but I've also seen a lot of lazy use of it as well. Other strategies that aren't talked about in the textbook that you might consider, feel free to use some humor. I'm giving a speech on, say, how I'm a Zen Buddhist, okay? And I want to start off with a little joke that goes something like this. What did the Zen Buddhist say to the hot dog vendor? Make me one with everything. Okay, I'm going to let you just catch up and think about that one. Oh, catch up. So even there, I followed up with another joke. The joke, of course, if you know anything about Zen Buddhism and ordering hot dogs, make me one with everything is something a Zen Buddhist might say. Make me one with the universe, right? So make me one with everything. Ha, 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 hilarious. And suddenly you like me, you like my speech, boom, the primacy effect. So feel free to use some humor when appropriate, of course. The topic needs to be something that's not terribly serious, I imagine, and avoid any kind of offensive humor that might be sexist, racist, homophobic, things like that. You don't want to alienate people with your humor. You want to bring them in. Here's one of my favorite approaches. Okay, which is the building of suspense, the building of curiosity, the building of intrigue, kind of like creating a little bit of a riddle in the minds of your audience that they got to actively solve or think about. You got to be a little creative here, but this is super effective. Let me give you an example. It's your constant companion. It's with you everywhere you go. It's the first thing you look at when you wake up, the last thing you look at when you fall asleep. You look at it at the gym. It's with you in the grocery store. It's with you while you're even driving. I am, of course, talking about your cell phone. Okay, so I built up some suspense. I got you guessing what it is. Maybe you got there, maybe you didn't. Ultimately, I revealed that I'm going to be giving a speech that has something to do with cell phones. Maybe I'm going to talk about the dangers of driving with your cell phone. Now here's another one. Relate to your audience, interact with your audience, or try to activate the audience in some way. Maybe you can ask your audience to imagine something. So here's an example. Imagine being dropped into a foreign country that you don't know. You're surrounded by squiggles and scribbles that just don't make sense. You can't read the signs, you can't order from a menu, or even apply for a job. Now imagine this is in a foreign country, but it's your own country. Well, that's exactly what adults who can't read experience every day. Okay, so this did a little bit of suspense, curiosity. It also asked the audience to imagine themselves in that situation. So this is a little bit of both of these two, building suspense and relating to the audience. You might startle or surprise your audience. Imagine waking up and finding out that the value of $1 has plummeted. You can't pay your bills, you can't pay your rent, you can't even use the money you have in your bank to buy food. Well, this very thing happened to the good people of Venezuela very recently. So this is going to talk about the economy and politics in Venezuela, right? Okay, so I kind of asked my audience to imagine that as a way of startling them and surprising them. I also built a bit of suspense in that example as well. I want you to consider ways maybe of being physical while you're performing your attention getter. If you can do any physical movements that go along with it, that's great. For example, I've had a student who was talking about being part of a dance team, and they started their speech by doing some dance moves. I had a student who told a story about a time where they gave a proposal to somebody for marriage and actually were rejected. And they actually ahead of time told one of the students in the class who was watching the speech that they were going to try to reenact this with them. They were going to drop to their knees, they were going to ask this person to marry them, and that person should tell them no. So he put like a plant in the audience, if you will, and then had a pre-planned physical interaction with the audience. A little complex, but it's something that you could do. I have students who were talking about working out and going to the gym who did push-ups when they were starting their speech. I had another student who asked a person in the back of the room to shut off the lights in the room right when they started talking, and the speech they were talking about was about the loss of energy in the future, energy production in the future, and the possibility of living with rolling blackouts and rolling brownouts. So any kind of physicality, you can get creative with this, and in general, just be creative with these strategies. You can combine them, recombine them. You could certainly use a strategy or form that's already been used, but the more unique, the more you take a risk or do something fun, I think the better results you're going to get. Also, if you take a risk and do something fun and it doesn't really work, I'll still reward you with points just for trying. If you kind of use something that's just a throwaway or isn't very creative or interesting, that's how you're going to start losing points. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. Let me just summarize. Don't waste the first moments of your speech. Use one of these strategies and be creative. Remember to rehearse this attention getter many times for effectiveness. You want to perform it with crispness and naturalness and confidence. Make eye contact right away. Don't begin by reading. And please, no casual introductions in this class. Hey, how are you? How you doing? My name is John. I'm talking about this. Okay, start with a bang. Start with something creative. Start with your attention getter. That is literally what I'm asking you to do. All right, hope this was helpful.